Okay, so today I'm a really lucky guy. I get to meet you and encourage you about what an exciting place this is, and I get to introduce today's speaker. So you've been hearing how intellectually diverse SoMAS is. That allows us to be bold in the scope and challenging nature of problems that we pursue. And our speaker today is no less bold. So our speaker is relatively new SoMAS professor Melissa Finucane, who is the current holder of the William and Jane Knapp Endowed Infinity Chair. I'm all out of jokes about the name Infinity Chair, but suffice it to say that Professor Finucane's aspirations to make a difference know no bounds. So Melissa's scholarship is sometimes in the area of perception and communication of risk and uncertainty related to climate resilience and disaster recovery, and other things that she's going to talk about today. She is a proud Aussie by birth, spending her formative years in Western Australia. She completed all of a bachelor's, master's, and PhD in psychology. I want to stop here for a moment and say that SoMAS is the kind of school that would believe that it's a good idea for us to hire a psychologist, perhaps so that we have help in answering the question, are you crazy? You think one school is able to make a difference with a problem like climate change? Yes, we are. In fact, we believe that one student can make a big difference. I grew up knowing about a grad student working on a global problem who ended up getting the Nobel Prize for the work that they did as a grad student. So it can be you, making a huge difference. So welcome to SoMAS, where we aspire to doing that. So prior to coming to SoMAS, after her studies in Western Australia, Melissa went on to a postdoc-y sort of thing at University of Oregon, and then was lucky enough to spend time in Hawaii. More recently, she was co-director of the Climate Resilience Center at the RAND Corporation, and after that, Vice President of Science and Innovation at the Union of Concerned Scientists. So let's let Dr. Finucane tell us how she wants to make important change happen.
Thanks, Dave. Thank you, Dave. Can you all hear me at the back? Yes, thank you. I like this. So I am so excited to be here on this particular day. I'm going to tell you a little bit about why I'm here at Stony Brook and why I think you all belong here too. The bottom line is that if you want to make change happen with science and innovation, then I think you're in the right room. I personally am passionate about using robust evidence and interdisciplinary collaborations, but also collaborations across sectors to really help us understand the risks that we face, particularly environmental health risks, but also what we can do to address those risks. I have something in common with the prospective students here in that I only joined a couple of months ago. So let me say why, and it's partly because of the sentiments that Dean Shepson just shared. But what I observed was that the SoMAS community cares deeply about the environment and the world around us. They also care about this community, the SoMAS and the Stony Brook community, but they deeply care about creating the next generation of climate leaders. And so that's why I'm here, and that's why I think everyone in this room will have a place and a contribution to make to that important challenge. Lost my... All right, so here's a basic roadmap for my talk today. First, I'm going to spend a little bit of time explaining why it's important to generate rigorous evidence and build interdisciplinary and cross-sectoral relations or collaborations to assess and address complex risks like climate change. I'm using this picture here of an endangered monk seal and his Laysan albatross friend because my climate origin story is really from Hawaii. Happy to share that with you at some point, but this reminds me of my personal why, and I'm sure each of you have your own why as well. Whoops. These are Google slides. Right. Okay, there's going to be a few glitches in the. It's okay. It's okay. I could. No, don't worry about it. Behind the curtain, coming up soon, you will see. We're going to spice it up a little bit and talk about sex and politics, sociodemographics, and historic policies that have led us to this moment that really need to be understood in combination with the physical and engineering science that is more predominant in conversations about how do we deal with climate risk. And then following that, behind the curtain, we have implications for policy and practice. So we're going to talk a little bit about what does this all mean? What does a more comprehensive understanding of risk mean for addressing policy and practice challenges? All right, so the first reason I think this is important is climate leadership. As you may have observed, climate leadership is under fire right now. Particularly in the spotlight is anything related to climate and social equity. And so the need for climate leadership is more important than ever before. And I think you will have observed that there are significant efforts to sideline or undermine and eliminate climate data, climate reports, tools, websites, federal scientists working in this area. Advisory committees, institutions, and I would argue scientific integrity itself. So you are really important, and this home, SoMAS and Stony Brook, will support you in developing the skills that you need to be a climate leader. To me, climate leadership means creating the conditions where scientific evidence is integrated seamlessly into real-world decision-making to address this wicked societal challenge. And it requires ambition and action, integrity, impact, and accountability. So that's really what motivates me in what I choose to research and the things I'd like to share with students here. All right, the second reason I think this is really important is the economy, and essentially usable climate information is in demand. Even if we're sidelining policies and projects related to clean energy under this administration, billion-dollar disasters are not stopping. This is a map of the 2025 billion-dollar disasters. I think there's about 23 that communities around the country are dealing with in terms of either recovering from these ones or preparing for the next set of disasters. And so usable climate information is in hot demand across all sectors, whether you're talking about agriculture, energy, health, education, international security, or homeland security. And so generating usable climate information is a really big part of what I'm hoping we can build into the next generation of climate leaders. A 2025 report by the World Resources Institute estimated that in the next decade, we'll generate about 375 million jobs globally for the clean energy sector in the economy. Others have estimated last year there were like 3.5 million clean energy jobs in 2024, sorry, not last year, which is more than the folks employed as elementary school teachers or cashiers, nurses, and others. So this is a really big sector of the economy, and it's only going to grow. And then the last reason I'll give you for this being important is that this uptick in demand for usable climate information has been met already with a burgeoning amount of information and tools. Not all of it is useful, but it's supposed to help support decisions that people are making around this climate thing, as I've heard it referred to. But it's important to recognize that it's not just information and tools generation that is needed, but an actual understanding of the climate sensitive decisions that are being made and by whom, whether they're in government agencies, nonprofit groups, or other areas, private sector, We have to understand the actual decisions that are being made in the context in which those decisions are being made. And then we have to think about how do we most effectively communicate about complex concepts like risk and uncertainty to those decision makers in those contexts, in a way that they can use the information we have as rapidly and as effectively as possible. All right, last reason I'll give you for this being really important, that we use and generate usable data and cross-disciplinary and cross-sectoral collaborations, is that we need to improve and refine our understanding and the theoretical models we have, but also the methods we use to understand the resilience or dysfunctional trajectories of communities and individual households as they face climate risk. So over the years, I've worked with a bunch of folks to develop this particular model that illustrates climate risks like hurricanes or flooding as shocks that impact nested sets of individuals, communities, the governance structures they're in, and the built natural world that they live in. And we need to understand that adaptive capacities, as well as chronic and acute stressors on those communities related to the particular risk event or other things, really impacts the recovery or dysfunctional trajectory. And it's usually a combination of these things. The reason that's important is it helps us to identify points of intervention or support in advance of disaster events that people are experiencing. All right, revealed. Door number 2, human dimension. So the spicy part, feeling, sex, politics, historical policies. Let's talk a little bit about that and why I think this is important. So if you think about it, we make literally hundreds of risk decisions every day. What kind of transport to take to work, how fast to drive on any particular road, what kind of drugs should you take? Should you fish or swim in a stream that may or may not be polluted? Should you buy hurricane insurance or flood insurance, etc.? Should you use AI for your next paper or report? And some of these decisions can have really large impacts and consequences for our lives. But it turns out that probability of death or damage or destruction is not the only piece of information that all of us use to estimate and respond to risk. And in fact, the field of risk perception and communication was established originally because of this observation of a large gap between risk regulators and technologists who were coming up with one estimate of a risk, and communities who thought they were really missing the point and making assessments of the wrong risks. So on the one hand, we have these frustrated scientists and regulators who thinks that the public is irrational, or at least at minimum misinformed. And on the other hand, we have communities who think that the scientists and regulators are really assessing the wrong risks. So this is important because I think that understanding how people navigate their way through uncertain and risky information can really help us tailor the way that we generate and communicate information in a way that people can use it appropriately in their risk decision processes. So a little detour, since I started my life as a psychologist, cognitive and social psychologist, and worked on something called the affect heuristic and understanding how we integrate experiential and analytic processes to come up with our risk responses. A lot of work has shown us that we do have these two different systems for information processing. The analytic system, on the one hand, is very slow and deliberative. It takes time and requires reasoning and evidence via logic or data to come up with a justification. On the other hand, we have the experiential system, which is actually older from an evolutionary perspective. This is holistic and affective or pleasure pain oriented. It's rapid, sometimes subconscious. And it encodes reality in concrete images as well as narratives and metaphors. So if you think about crossing a busy street, you can stand on the curb and try and estimate the velocity of the oncoming vehicles, the likelihood of impact if you leave at a certain point in time, the consequences, the economic damage to your life, should you get hit, etc. But if you were to do that about every single risk decision that you need to make every day, you would be stuck in analysis paralysis. So instead, we use a combination of analysis and experiential processing to identify things that we value and want to pursue, and things that we feel are threats and want to ignore. So this is how we comprehensively evaluate risk information. So one of the early observations, aside from the big gap between scientists and communities' understandings of risk or perceptions of risk, was gender differences. And so this is a graph from an early study by Slovak and colleagues. So what was observed was this, that men tended to perceive less risk across a whole range of technologies and risky activities compared with women. And one explanation given for this was called the irrationality explanation, wherein people with the lower risk perceptions thought that others didn't have the appropriate information or knowledge or expertise to judge the risk. But so in this particular study, they asked toxicologists, male and female toxicologists, all of whom we can assume have a very advanced understanding of risk analysis techniques. And they just asked them to rate all these different hazardous activities and technologies on a scale from 1 to 4, everything from nuclear waste to radon and indoor and outdoor air pollution, medical x-rays, and so on. And what they found is, this is what we call a tornado graph. And they found that women across all these items were more likely than men to give a higher risk rating for the items, or nearly all the items, not entirely all of them. So then I arrived as a sort of postdoc and started looking at deeper or other alternate explanations for some of these sociodemographic patterns that we found. This is a picture from a study we did with lay people. And basically on the left there, you see this effect that has come to be known as the white male effect. So across all these different activities and technologies, white males on average gave lower risk perception ratings than did white females and other males and females. But then we looked a little bit further. This is a national survey. So we had oversampled the what I call people of the global majority. So we could separate out Black and brown and Asian groups from, just considering it white and others. And we still found, to some extent, the white male effect, but the picture was obviously more complicated than that. So we started scratching the surface. And in fact, we saw in some items here that white males gave lower risk perception ratings than others. So we started scratching the surface a little bit more. Long story short, not that I'm that old, but risk perceptions ultimately really reflect deep-seated values and worldviews. What we found was that that group with the lowest risk perceptions, regardless of gender or race, had values that were more consistent with hierarchical worldviews, and they were more likely to disagree with egalitarian worldviews, and also to disagree with community-based decision processes. So in a way, it's unfortunate that the effect was called the white male effect, because it's not really about gender or race at all. It's about values and underlying worldviews that guide how you organize information about the world and your understanding of whether something is presenting a risk to you or not. What seems to be most important is that it's really about the level of control and benefit you have related to the issue. So the folks that are controlling, maintaining, benefiting from a particular activity or technology are the ones that are most likely to have the lowest risk perceptions. And these are also the ones that are more likely to have hierarchical rather than egalitarian worldviews. All right, one more fun study. Others from behavioral decision research, which is the field that I come from, have looked at political affiliation and how that might relate to estimation of probability. So in this study, David Budescu, who's at Fordham University, and his colleagues asked people, they presented to people a number of different verbal statements about probabilities that you would find in an IPCC report. So for instance, they showed people the statement, it's very likely that hot extremes, heat waves, and heavy precipitation events will continue to become more frequent. And then they asked them on a scale from 0 to 100, tell us what your best estimate of this probability being conveyed by the IPCC is. So they did that for verbal statements that reflected very unlikely, unlikely, likely, and very likely. And then on the right, you can see that everybody gets it wrong. there's this human tendency to gravitate toward the middle of a scale, so 50%. But what it means, and this is also consistent with other work that we've found, things of low probability are overestimated, and things of high probability tend to be underestimated. But more interestingly, they found a relationship also between political affiliation and risk or probability estimates, in that Democrats, compared with others, Republicans and others, tended to give higher risk as probability estimates for those verbal statements. And this is, of course, and same with the other studies, controlling for income and education and all the good things that could also be explaining these results. All right, so let me zoom out a little bit, out the time there. And instead of looking at features of individual decision makers, let's look at more at the socio-political context in which these risks are being experienced and judgments are being made about how do we respond to these risks. So I want to say first a couple of words about disparate risk experiences or climate impacts on different groups and what the key drivers are. So there's a large body of research now that has demonstrated and concluded that underserved groups are experiencing disproportionate impacts of extreme heat, storms, flooding, and climate-related pollution. Some studies have linked these disparate impacts with historic policies like redlining. So that's in the 1930s, where financial institutions were less likely to provide mortgages or insurance or other types of financial support to specific geographic areas. They've also related this to the dispossession and forced migration of Indigenous people and a systematic disinvestment in poor communities and communities of colour. So this is just one illustration of what the evidence can picture for us. This is a figure I made for the Northeast chapter in the 5th National Climate Assessment. I've given and that actually might be the old, oh no, that's the updated links. The federal government has taken down all evidence of the 5th National Climate Assessment. But you can still find it fairly easily. So in this figure, we did this using a tool that was developed by my colleagues at RAND and the Mid-Atlantic Regional Integrated Sciences and Assessment Project, which is funded by NOAA. And basically, what they're showing here is that historically redlined areas, which are shown with the C's and D's, experience on average higher summer temperatures than the non-redlined areas. And so this leads to a greater likelihood of heat exposure in areas with lower socioeconomic status and higher percentages of racial and ethnic minorities. And you can do this for a bunch. This is the Bronx, but you can do it pretty much all over the country. All right, last example of socio-political context mattering. If you recall, we have a history of land dispossession and forced migration of tribal nations in North America. There's a paper that was published in Science in 2021 by John Farrell and his colleagues that has shown this radical reduction in land access from over 54 million square kilometers historically to just over 600,000 square kilometers for present day land for the tribes that still have a land base. But then what they did was look at different climate variables. So for instance, here we have on the left, they showed that compared with historic lands, present day lands on average are more exposed to 2 additional extreme heat days per year and 23% less precipitation. They also did this for wildfire risk, and I want to say one other climate variable. But I think that, for drought, that was the other one they did. I think that the main takeaway here is that the threat from climate change for tribal nations is in part because they don't have access to their historic lands. And as species migrate and climate changes reduce the access to resources and spiritual elements of their culture, that there are increased risk of mental and other harms that they're very happy to share about in congressional testimony in the the National Climate Assessment and other venues. So the evidence is a combination of reports from tribal nations, but also this kind of analysis that explains the difference of historic and current day experiences. All right. I think I have time. I'm going to just talk briefly about one more program that I led, and then turn to policy and practice. So I've been talking a lot about understanding the socio-demographic and political context in which communities are experiencing and responding to risk. I established this thing called the Consortium for Resilient Gulf Communities in 2015 with funding from the Gulf of Mexico Research Initiative. The anchor institution was the Rand Gulf States Policy Institute, but you can see on the left there we collaborated with a whole range of different universities and other organizations in the region, in the Gulf region. But we also collaborated with businesses, local and state government agencies, other stakeholders like faith-based organizations and health clinics. And this is a picture of our team, some of our researchers, graduate students, and advisory committee members standing on the heliport or the helipad in Bristow, which is in Galliano. It's about 40 miles southwest of New Orleans. It's where they ferry workers to and from the oil rigs, but also after the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, where a lot of rescue and safety support was being coordinated from. So our focus was unique in that we integrated a lot of social and economic science into an understanding of the human dimensions of the impact of the oil spill, because in fact, not many people were exposed. Not many people actually touched oil or the dispersants. And in their infinite wisdom, they funded about 90% of the $500 million went to funding physical and chemical and biological studies only, looking at, for instance, the fate and transport of the oil and the dispersants. And they didn't really integrate anything about human dimensions. So that's why we came along 5 years later. We did many different things, but one thing we did was establish a probabilistic sample for surveying about people's experiences with the oil spill, but also a lot of other information. So we collected standardized measures of mental health outcomes, participation in local organizations, where they got their information from about the oil spill. And so we have a really rich database of folks. This was originally designed as a cross-sectional study that was going to be a one-off thing. At the time that we had the money to do this, we had 2,500 people from across all 5 Gulf states participate. They all lived within 100 miles of the coastline. But subsequently, we received other awards to repeat the surveys and expand them. So now we have 6 total waves of data collection from the same people who have experienced multiple disasters, the oil spill to start with, and then multiple hurricanes, and then, of course, COVID. So it's a really unique data set that hopefully will continue to grow. I'll just give you one example of a finding from my colleague Vanessa Parks, who used the initial data. She was looking at the relationship between the size of a social support network and the probability of screening positive for depression. And what you would normally expect is that the more friends you have, the more resources you might have access to in your time of need. So a disaster comes along, you find yourself out of a job or with a medical problem. So the more friends or social support you have available, the better off you should be. And so the better mental health outcomes you would expect. But she found that for fishers, the opposite was true. Several analyses later, what we suspect was happening was that the breadth of the impact on the fishing community in terms, because the closures were widespread. I think over 250,000 square kilometers of really good fishing area was closed. So the catches and the revenues were down. But it wasn't just that aspect of the economic impact of fishing, but the social ties and the disruption to the routines that fishers have and the community that they've established. And so if you're a fisher and you have this experience and you look up and are looking for support, the more people in your community you ask, the more you realize how widespread this problem was for them. And so they experienced a higher likelihood of screening positive for depression and other mental health challenges. All right. Let me see. So, sorry, I got. I think the last thing I'll say on that is just the point of doing this kind of work in concert with, integrated with the economic analyses, the physical science, and the science that helps us understand impacts on the natural world is really important because it helps us look for multiple points of intervention, but also ways of understanding what are the drivers of the experiences of folks that are most in need. And I'm going to talk a little bit now about the traditional ways of assessing risk has been looking at damage to assets, and it really misses these social and emotional impacts on communities that are the ones that our government is supposed to support with our taxpayer dollars. All right, the last door here, implications for policy and practice. So from my beginnings as an experimental and social psychologist, it became clear to me pretty quickly that we haven't arrived here by accident. Rather, the challenges that we're facing today are the result of myriad decisions that have been compounded over time by the values of the people most likely to be at the decision-making table. And that has baked in certain worldviews and values that reflect certain outcomes and prioritization of the resources we have available to understand and address the risks that we face. So I'm going to focus on policy and practice because rather than individual behavior change, because I think it's the fastest, largest way we can have impact for a problem of this size. So broadly speaking, the debate around how to equitably allocate taxpayer dollars is not new to federal or any other public department or agency, but I'd argue that in the face of a tax on science at this moment, in the current political environment, that there's now more than ever a need to really have defensible frameworks and methods and metrics for making those investment decisions and tracking their impacts over time. Are we really reducing risk, mitigating risk, and improving resilience in the areas that have the greatest need? So historically, technical risk assessments were really developed and refined over time using the latest insights and methods from engineering and other physical sciences. But unfortunately, that resulted in this baked in wealth bias, if you will, because the risk assessments ultimately say that you have to have assets that are damaged to count as being at risk. So poor people, renters who don't own a house, or people that live in communities that don't have a lot of wealthy investment and development, don't register on that risk scale. So when federal or other government agencies are deciding where do we put this money, if they use these traditional risk assessment techniques, we've seen that the resources tend to go to those more wealthy individuals in areas. So there's been a lot of interest, at least in the before times, in the last 10 years of trying to figure out alternative ways of counterbalancing or integrating equity considerations like differential cost sharing. So what's an example of a federal policy that did this? Sorry, I was going to reveal this slowly, but you can have it all at once. So in the before times, I worked a lot with FEMA and their Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program, which is no longer a thing, but it was in 2020. So this is a program that was designed to help states and local communities or governments and tribal nations to address climate risk and other natural hazard risks. And it explicitly asked the applicants to consider future climate projections. So that was very unusual. So it was quite a state-of-the-art program. So one thing we did was help FEMA establish a logic model for understanding and evaluating are the things that they're doing actually resulting in equitable risk reduction. So for instance, in the first year in 2020, they were given $500 million. Fun fact, there were $3.1 billion of applications for these funds because communities of all stripes and colors recognize that climate risks are real and they're having impacts and they, things need to change. And they could apply for natural, green infrastructure solutions or grey infrastructure or a range of different types of projects were eligible for this. When you release a notice of funding opportunity, usually we'll specify different technical and qualitative criteria that a program wants to prioritize. So the applicants know what they need to do to be eligible and win some part of the pot of money. In this particular case, in the first iteration, FEMA was interested in really trying to support economically disadvantaged rural communities. So these are small communities of, I think, 3,000 or less people and 80% per capita income on average, 80% of the national average. They were hoping that they would be able to give a higher proportion of a federal cost share to these communities, so the smaller communities didn't have to come up with as much funding or other resources. But when we got to the impacts part of this model, we realized very quickly that the traditional way of assessing risk really limited our ability to assess whether equitable impacts were actually occurring. Were we able to reduce pre-event susceptibility, improve coping capacity or adaptive capacity? So let me just spend one more slide looking at that to show you how we started conceiving of this. And to me, in hindsight, it doesn't seem like rocket science, but it was not done before. And it really helped an agency like FEMA rethink how they were making those decisions about where do we put taxpayer dollars to solve this particular problem. So the top left blue box there is your traditional risk assessment approach. So we're leaning here on an approach by Mark Vida, who's at Stanford, and some of her colleagues at the World Bank. It's a consumption reduction or consumption loss model from economics. So they start with the assessment of damage to the built environment. So that's your traditional risk assessment. But then they went further and they looked at the effects of that damage on productivity across sectors in the economy of the area that had been impacted. Then they went further and looked at the impacts on employment and income losses at the individual levels. So these are, include people who maybe work in restaurants that were damaged by a particular disaster event, not just people who owned the buildings whose income might have been directly affected that way. And then the last step, which I thought was particularly important, is then they estimated well-being losses at the household level relative to the initial wealth and income levels of the people. So it was a relative estimate. So, the impact of losing a month of your salary for someone who doesn't earn very much is much bigger than someone who has a lot of resources and wealth or other opportunities for income substitution. So that's kind of where that got to, and then the world changed. But I think there's a lot more work to be done there. And again, just highlighting the importance of these cross-disciplinary collaborations. All right, last example, if federal policy is too big a bite of the apple for you, there are lots of ways that we can integrate physical science information, particularly about risk, about climate risk and climate data into local, state and local level decision-making and planning. I mentioned previously the Mid-Atlantic Research Group, which is funded by NOAA, has developed a lot of different tools. This one, the CHAMP tool, it was specifically for sustainability officers who are often tasked with the development or updating of hazard mitigation plans, which, another fun fact, is required for eligibility for much of the federal disaster mitigation money. So you have to have this plan, you have to put your project, you have to get your project in there, but they also have to think about how do we consider future climate conditions or historic climate conditions under different scenarios. So this is the landing page for the tool. You can start at the state level or a county level. We worked with the Sustainability Directors Network, which is a professional body that coordinates the work of sustainability officers, but also the Northeast Regional Climate Centre. So we were trying to integrate the needs of the people that ultimately were using the climate information, but also the constraints that our climate scientists knew were relevant for the data and the modelling that we wanted to use. So you dive in here. The other thing that this process of co-development of a tool like this helped us do is realize that in the real world, people don't start with a climate variable. They don't say, I want to know, the number of days of precipitation over 1 or 2 inches. They start with, oh, I have a flooding issue. And then they want to know a specific, is it a coastal flooding or, other types of flooding. Then they want to know, yeah, I'm really, it's an agricultural area. So then I want to know about the impact on crops or other, impacts across different sectors that are relevant. And then they want to get to the specific climate variables. So we were able to set up this tool so that we could follow the natural pathway of the decision makers so that they ultimately could get to the most relevant climate information and integrate that. So this tool, you can get that information in narrative form as well as in graphs. You can also download the data if you want to put your graph in a particular format for your report. But it's been updated many times over the last 5 years. And I think it's better and better because of that iterative feedback loop that we have. All right, I'm going to just say a final few words and end. Let me just remind you what we talked about behind the secret doors. We started with why is this important? It's important for democracy. This is important for the economy. And this is important for developing our theoretical models and our methods that help us understand the risks that people face and how we can address them. We also talked about more spicy stuff like sociodemographics, the political context in which policies have been developed and implemented, and how a rich understanding of people's experiences of risk and ways of making decisions about how to respond to those risks really help us in our efforts to communicate about and address the risks. And then we talked a little bit about the policies and practices and how this comprehensive understanding of risk can help us improve the policies and practices we have as we think about how do we invest taxpayer dollars to assess and fix some of these problems. So I think in conclusion, I just say that action-oriented climate leadership needs to build on robust data, but also on these interdisciplinary collaborations and collaborations cross-sectorally. I think that we need people that understand the climate system. We need people who understand how changes in the climate system impact different natural and built environments. We need to understand how we can make these assessments and tackle these problems in a way that doesn't ignore poor people or communities of color. We need people who understand how decisions are made and how we can communicate uncertainty and risk concepts effectively so that there's a quick and rapid uptake of this information. And so that leads me to conclude that everybody in this room has an important piece of the puzzle within your knowledge and your toolkit, and you're going to learn more about that. But we all need to work together because it's going to take all of us to really try and turn this ship around. So I will stop there.
Okay, so one of the things that we do at the end of every seminar is that the first question or two goes to one of the first-year graduate students in our program. And so I think we have Jules and Naomi today. So I see Naomi first. I know you're right there, but I somehow saw Naomi first.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I think it's so interesting and important, the research that you're doing and all the factors that go into assessing risk. So the question that I had was, how do you identify what communities to prioritize when you're focusing on improving equity or creating like policy and funding surrounding equity metrics? like, have the communities already been impacted by a disaster, or are you looking at communities that are most at risk for being impacted by a disaster? Is this more of like a case by case basis?
Yeah, well, it depends on the agency that you're working with, but you can do everything across the disaster continuum from preparation for and building resilience in advance of a disaster through to response and recovery. I've worked mostly in the recovery area, so not the immediate aftermath. But looking at different ways of identifying who's at risk, not only in the current sense, so that a government's priority usually is getting the economy back up and running as quickly as possible. But that sometimes can lead to decisions that impact communities negatively in the long term. So we're often about trying to illustrate and unearth the consequences of decisions across geographic areas, but across time as well. So we'll use a range of different metrics. There's no shortage of different indices of identifying at-risk areas or groups that you might want to try and support. The Brook program used the economically disadvantaged rural communities indicator in 2020, but they've shifted. There are different ways, high unemployment or high percentage minority populations. Honestly, I think that in some ways that's a distraction from the real task of thinking through, these are the resources I have, and this is the type of work I want to support. How does that meet the needs of the people in the area at the time? And the sociodemographic indices, especially when you collapse a lot of variables into that, miss the point of, and sometimes they're actually inconsistent. They have internal inconsistency or external invalidity. So it's it's nuanced, but there's a lot of data, and I think the challenge that people don't like to do that takes time is actually spend the time to think through the logic model of how what you have is going to impact and what kind of impacts you might have.
Hi, Melissa. I thought your talk was excellent. I thought it was a really good presentation. Before I ask a question, I just want to say that I really admire and appreciate you speaking so candidly about the political landscape. And I shout out to prospective students. I like that SoMAS is a place where people are free to do that. And as for my question, I wanted to ask you more about this gap that you spoke about between risk estimators and actual at-risk communities. And like, what are the frictions there at like a personal or community level? And then I was wondering specifically if you could talk about like your time in Hawaii maybe, and like what it was like there. Just because I'm personally curious.
Sure. So I think the gaps are really expressed just as frustrations from both perspectives. So scientists will often, and I'm guilty of this too, I have the answer. I have the model. I have done very controlled experiments or very refined and thoughtful statistical analyses that will tell you this is what's happening. And then communities will say, well, you haven't lived here. You have no idea what it's like to try and deal with X, Y, or Z. And I think that the integration of the two different types of expert knowledge is what's really difficult, because both sides don't necessarily value or appreciate and acknowledge the value of each other. So that's been the tension. And it's often when you take a step back and say, well, what are we really trying to do here? It's either maintain a certain way of life that is consistent with a certain set of values, or improve and change something toward a set of values. And that is the part that I think is the most fruitful area for groups, scientists, regulators, and communities to come together and figure out how they can work together. My time in Hawaii, I was there 12 years and working in the whole Asia Pacific region, actually. So often working in very developing contexts or areas that had been underserved historically. So that included some Indigenous perspectives, but a lot of it was around freshwater management. So freshwater is held in public trust in Hawaii, which is unusual. So the decisions about who gets how much water from where on the island is very dry, very wet parts of the island. And on Hawaii, it's volcanic aquifers. So it takes a long time for the fresh water to go through all that volcanic rock. So the decisions around who gets the fresh water, and also there's a lot of drought has been happening over time, which people don't often know. So those decisions are very contentious. There's big ag and the less now, but the sugarcane industry. There's indigenous people who want to use the water for taro farming or other traditional practices. And then there's just the regular person who needs to turn their tap on in Honolulu or in a rural area, and they want clean water and they want enough water. So they're the kinds of things that I worked on, helping the Water Commission come up with a prioritization process for thinking how do they get the expressions of interest and values from different stakeholder groups, and then how do they integrate that information and come up with an outcome that balances all of those different considerations.
Is there like a lot of work being done in like the trust building sector, like of this conversation, like to get that?
Yes, that is a big part of helping people work together, is understanding each other, and a lot of that just comes from repeated experiences over time of realizing that the pilots flying the plane also want to get down to the ground safely. Passengers have different concerns, but they're at the mercy of certain people, and so trying to build trust is really important.
Thank you.
Other questions? Chef has a small question.
So it's
Me first.
sure. Yep.
Thank you. Thank you for your talk. I thought it was really interesting. I wanted to backtrack more to like the more conceptual parts about like the white male and the irrationality effects. So I wanted to ask, like, what do you think are like the reasons for these kinds of effects? Because actually it's my first time hearing about like this kind of like lowered risk perception by like white males, I guess.
So a lot of research done over several decades and around the world suggests that it's not about gender or race, it's about these deep-seated values. So for instance, if you go to Sweden, for instance, that gender difference is not as observable. In fact, in many cases, it actually doesn't exist. It's really the folks that are more hierarchical and have more control over and manage and benefit from risks are the ones that will have lower risk perception, which makes sense if you think about it. Probably through exposure, you know your risk if you're dealing with it at a more experiential level, but you also see benefit. You're benefiting from something. The risk estimate will go down. Interesting correlate the benefit estimate, which is not how it is in the real world.
And does this like differ with like our current like changing social media landscapes, or is it very much just about how much power like a particular person holds at a given time?
That I don't know. I think the changing social media landscape is definitely influencing how information and what information, disinformation is being shared. But I'm not familiar with the overall findings of the studies.
Thank you.
Chef.
Yeah, great talk. So I'm really fascinated by the questions around, how do you measure impact, and how does one decide which sorts of responses help the most people and what groups and so on. I was fascinated by the plot of, I guess it was a measure of mental health for fishers and non-fishers versus a measure of social support. Tell us what you can about how well we can quantify social support. And if you had, you had vertical error bars, if you had error bars on that x-axis, what would that look like? And where is the social science of understanding what kinds of social support are helpful.
Yeah, there's a huge body of literature now on what's called social capital. So there are many different measures at many different levels and many different variables that capture different aspects of what it is that's valuable from your social network. And it could relate to economics, but it relates also to sense of place and identity. And I think that where Vanessa was going with her research is to really think about not just the fisher people that are going out and catching fish, but the other households that are dependent on that sector because they are seafood processors or they are restaurant owners or they work in a restaurant that serves fish. And then her research has shown that there are a lot of habitual behavioral patterns that are disrupted when a disaster occurs. And so in this case, it just turned out that there were more widespread problems for this particular communities. I think that she would, I'm sorry, I'm trying to channel her because this is really her field of expertise. I think some of the key counterintuitive findings are things like if you, actually there's actually lots of great studies in them. If you are assuming that you're in a community that looks like you and supports you for the most part, that you'll be better off. But in fact, it's not true. Sometimes you can be in the majority in a community, but the community is in a larger context where they are not necessarily supported by the governance or policy structures. So it can get more complex. I think the point is that to have a more nuanced understanding of the impact of what you're measuring and the mechanisms by which you think support should be helping or hindering is really important because we can't just assume that more people or a bigger network or more resources ultimately leads to better success and outcomes.
I think Raji had a question.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I have a question about the framework you showed about Mark et al. That well-being losses are estimated related to households' initial assets and income. Since these broader impacts can persist over multiple different years, are those future well-being losses discounted similar to how we discount asset damages and cost-benefit analysis that FEMA or USCC follows?
Yeah, good question. I actually don't know. I would hope so. But yeah, I don't know. That's an important piece of the equation or puzzle.
Maybe Gordon or Carl or Bob or.
Well, just a thought that with these fisher communities, you've got, might it be explained by more competition for limited resources? You guys big community and are all have the same thing. Instead of going out and catching fish.
Could you repeat the question? I
think the question is more competition among fishers because, and so the supply and demand has suddenly been turned on its head. That is a piece of the puzzle, but I think the point was that I think that's important because fishers have less substitution options. So they have the opportunities for other income when their main source of income is eliminated, disappears. But in this case, the knock-on effects to the seafood processing and the restaurants and other tourism businesses kind of compounded that challenge of finding economic resources. So is it that I don't know.
But that example was just after the Deepwater Horizon.
Yeah,
right?
the closure went in some cases up to a year after the.
So those guys, I mean, I was down there that whole summer writing a book on it, being with some of the. They felt like their lives were over. What they were all saying and being told was that this may never open again. All the oil will go to the bottom. We will never fish again. We are completely done. And they had no margin of error. And so, the idea, like, I think it's kind of confounded because they have to be the most depressed segment because they were the ones who felt like they were finished for good. And that's not true of people who are running restaurant chains or even renting vacation places, because they knew that eventually this would be done, the summer would be over, there would be another year and things would come back. But the fishing people didn't think that. And the fishing people were the ones that had the suicides. So in a way, I kind of think it was confounded, because they're going to be the most depressed regardless, but they also had the biggest network because there's a huge network of fishing down there. So I don't know, I'm a little dubious. I think that might be a confounded effect.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot more work. I think the most important thing for us was that, so we were funded 5 years after the oil spill because, whoa, we need some human dimensions represented here. So aside from the challenge of identifying what's the right exposure metric to say, well, were you impacted? Certainly not a lot of people were actually touched the oil or the dispersants. But the economic impacts from the economic analyses show that as fisheries reopened, there was a quick rebound for the, in terms of catches and revenues. But still, your point is true that people remained very depressed and worried, kind of like with PTSD. And, we demonstrated higher alcohol use and other deleterious behavior. And I think that really confused the policymakers in that they're like, but now your fishing's back. You've had all these resources to support you in the meantime. Why are you still upset? And it's a good example of that kind of gap between what the technical science might say and the real experience of someone in that particular situation. So,
Bob?
I wanted to follow on Kennedy's questions earlier about the gender differences in this assessment.
Yeah.
And what age groups does that begin to lead here? I mean, are there any differences age based?
that is a great question. I don't know. I've only studied adults and that we control for age because, with more experience or knowledge about something, you might expect a different rating.
So one of the things that I have burned in my mind is watching the kids wait for the bus in the morning as our children are growing up. Often the boys were hanging upside down in the trees with their, ready to fall down and break their head open and so on and so forth. And the girls were to the side, often reading. So there was very, very different behavior. And obviously one group was at very high risk. And it just seems to me a very different thing than a value-based kind of thing. So I'm curious.
Yeah, well,
This
in
grows in.
biology, we can't rule that out, but there is definitely a reduction in the emphasis I placed on that because you don't see those gender differences transcending racial and ethnic differences. So I think that's the main takeaway from that. But as a mom of 2 teenage boys. I feel like-
All right, well, I think we have lunch after this, and Dr. Finucane will be at lunch. And so I would encourage everyone to migrate over to the Swanson room for something delicious. So thank you so much.